Hello and welcome back again for this China in Africa debates. I'm really happy to be here for this conversation. It's been a while since we had those talk where I had a guest to talk about different issues about China-Africa relationship. And today I'm having another guest. I'm having a guest that was already here with us before, talking about military China relationship, military China security in Africa. I'm having Paul Nantulya with me. Good afternoon to you, Paul, because I know that we're in the same part of the world. And today, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great in the city of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And I'm very happy to be on the show. I think I've been on this show.
Yes,
I'm losing count. I'm losing count.
yes, exactly.
And I,
You've been
and I guess
you've been
that's
on that.
I guess that's the big thing.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. It's a good thing in a space where we are seeing more and more the China Africa thought space kind of shrinking. And now when we have people like you keep on producing good content and good analysis, it's really for us an opportunity to have you to say, you know what, let's talk more because as much as that space is shrinking, but the China Africa space is still expanding, especially when you look into how China is engaging with Africa, how China has changed its engagement with Africa. We see that space keep on growing, but somehow on the policymaker side, on the academic side, we don't really seem to pay attention on how those changes are happening and what represent for us in terms of opportunity. Talking about those changes, we're going to talk about one important one, talking about the Global Security Initiative, the GSI. For those who don't know, it's among one of the three big China initiatives that China has put up since the last 3-4 years already. We have the Global Development Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, and the Global Security Initiative. Those initiatives are becoming China's foreign affairs pillar in how they engage countries in the global south and also in the rest of the world. It's really toward the way China is looking how the international system is changing and what kind of value it intends to put on the table. And today, when you talk about the Global Security Initiative, who better to talk about it with than Paul Nantulya when it comes to how GSI is taking place in Africa. I'm having Paul today for this conversation because Paul has wrote extensively about security initiative, but he recently wrote a paper that's called Africa as a testing ground for China's global security initiative. We know that during the last FOCAC, China and Africa signed a lot of agreements. In the FOCAC agreement, we had a lot of elements related to security, military cooperation, and we also saw the global security initiative being mentioned in the FOCAC final agreement. So, what does it mean exactly? What the GSI means for Africa? What's the value system of the GSI? Do we see ourselves into the GSI? GSI, how China is implementing GSI. All of those questions are going to be part of this conversation I'm going to have with Paul for the next, 30 minutes or so, hoping we'll keep it on time so people kind of understand better how China is evolving in Africa. So, Paul, back to you. Global Security Initiative. Before diving into what does it mean for Africa, let's look into the Global Security Initiative itself. What does it tell us about China's security vision and perspective on international system?
Yes, no, thank you very much. So the Global Security Initiative is one of three Chinese strategic concepts that speak to China's global ambitions and China's global role, basically, how China sees itself in the world. The other two initiatives are the Global Development Initiative, which is basically an effort by China to ramp up or increase its international development assistance, which has expanded quite significantly over the past 2 to 3 years. And then you have the Global Civilization Initiative, which is an effort by China to establish affinities with different countries and different organizations around the world that can advance a Chinese discourse on international problems, ranging from non-proliferation to peacekeeping operations, peace enforcement operations, to governance, and that sort of thing. So these are what you might call triplet initiatives. The
Mhm.
Global Security Initiative is the security component of that. It's a security component of that, and it is an effort by China to craft a narrative and language and discourse around pressing international problems of peace and security, problems of things like terrorism and counterterrorism, right? Transnational threats.
Mhm.
China perceives itself to be a returning global power.
Mhm.
And what do global powers do? Global powers shape international discourse around
Yeah.
security and things like that. So China has ascribed for itself that kind of role to be able to craft narratives and discourse, right? This is the reason why, under the Global Security Initiative, there are quite a number of high level security platforms
Mhm.
that China has put together, right, as alternative venues
Mhm.
for countries and organizations to discuss global problems, right? But as we point out in this study, the Global Security Initiative is also much more than just that. So there are a number of
Mhm.
initiatives, the Xinjiang Forum, the Shanghai Organization, on
Foreign
different
translation.
forums that are done by the People's Liberation Army, by the National Defense University, and so on. But it's much more than that. It has to be read together with the 2025 uh, Chinese national
Paper,
security
national
concept.
security paper. Yeah.
Yes, it's paper. And previous Chinese national security documents, which are basically framed around uh, domestic stability,
Mhm.
domestic stability meaning regime stability, meaning the stability of the ruling party, which
Mhm.
is effectively the backbone of China's governance, right? That
Yeah.
without the stability of the ruling party, actually, this is what the national security document states: without the security of the ruling party, then everything goes awry, right? There's
Yeah.
basically nothing. There's basically nothing there. So the Global Security Initiative is the external facing element of China's national security concept, which derives first and foremost from regime security and stability. But then, of course, there are also other elements. There are other elements in play in there, many of which are shared by a number of governments around the world, especially in the global south,
Mhm.
in the Central Asian states, in South Asia, in Latin America, and then of course on the African continent. But then there are also elements of the Global Security Initiative that seem very innocuous. Things like consultation, things like respect for legitimate security interest. But when you unpack what is meant by a legitimate security interest, it could cover everything from the stability of the regime to territorial claims and things of that nature. So we've
And this
seen
is
African countries, for instance. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and excuse me, allow me to
Yes.
interrupt you there. I think this is where you've mentioned in your paper the notion of indivisibility of security, the notion that
Yes.
China put in the visibility of security, in a sense where one nation on one group of nation cannot think of their or their own security issue at the expense of other stakeholders' legitimate concern. I think that's right, right?
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. And so, in that sense, we have seen China supporting African countries, individual African countries, if they've got claims of that nature, right? They can
Yeah.
expect to get support from the People's Republic of China, but in exchange, those countries also lend support to China, for instance, on around Tibet, around
Yeah.
Xinjiang, around the Hong Kong national security law, and around Taiwan, where we have seen
Yeah.
African countries and African diplomats actually register the support of their governments for Chinese positions on those issues, right? So the
Yeah.
concept of legitimate security interest is something that needs to be, effectively, when you unpack it, is when you begin to understand the substance of what the People's Republic of China is trying to do with the Global Security Initiative. The other element with the Global Security Initiative, as we mentioned earlier, is that it is heavily focused on the domestic aspect of security, right? So when you look
Yeah.
at the security capacity building and training that has been conducted under the GSI brand, it all tends to revolve around law enforcement, policing, things like intelligence, paramilitary work, coast guards, right? Coast guard actions and things of that nature. It's more focused on that, at least in terms of the countries that have been through this kind of training, than it is on the purely military to military work that the People's Liberation Army conducts with African countries, which includes professional military education. The GSI appears to be much more focused on the domestic side of things. Now, when you look at the domestic side of Chinese security, which of course is built around regime security, the
Mhm.
Chinese call it Wei Wen. Um, you find that many African political systems share similar perspectives on regime security and survival. So when you look at, for instance, you look at how countries organize their police forces, right? A police is a force. In fact, I mentioned it. A police is a force. You look at the ranks of police officers; they're military ranks, right? Lieutenant
Yeah.
generals and things of that nature. Secondly, the police is not just limited to internal law and order. It is essentially it operates almost like a military, right?
Mhm.
So when you look at that on the African continent, when you look at that, with African policing systems, which
Mhm.
are highly centralized, where, for instance, in some countries the police is under executive control within the president's
Yeah.
office,
Mhm.
right? You look at the People's Armed Police in China; it operates under very similar uh, institutional
Characteristic.
designs,
Yeah.
very very similar characteristics. So when you have the People's Armed Police meeting and engaging within the global security initiative architecture with African policing organizations, you find that they speak a common language
Yeah.
based on similar characteristics. So that's
Before
one of the elements of of
yeah,
of, uh, of, of GSI engagement.
before dwelling into that part, let's scale back a bit. You've mentioned so many interesting things that I think that going to resonate a lot among our audience to try to understand how the GSI came about in the in the context of African continent. You mentioned how GSI focus it's outside first fronting of China internal security and security challenge visions and all of that. And you mentioned so many things. I'm really trying to catch up the dose I'm gonna take that we're not gonna take us into a rabbit hole where we're gonna go into so many things because there are so many implications into what you've said. In the context of Africa, you've mentioned the characteristic. You've mentioned how there is some similarities on that. So here I'm speaking to your experience. When you when you look around the continent, when you look the type of engagement we've seen since the last couple of years, 3 4 years already, with the military exercise and the exchanges out of the FOCAC, we had the promises of training African military and police services and all of that. I think we talked about 5,000. If I don't know if I think I got the number wrong, but we got 1,000 numbers in terms of like people being trained. When you talk with your colleagues in Africa, when you talk about people in the security forces in Africa, do you get the sense that first of all they share the same type of no, first of all they understand China vision of GSI, they understand what it is, and second of all they share the same type of concern about GSI, or you have the sense that it's more of like, you know what, we see there are some aspects into the GSI that are useful for us in terms of regime security, regime stability, and we're gonna only tap into that without really aligning ourselves with behind that vision. What kind of perception that you get from African stakeholders when it comes to GSI?
That's a great question because it's actually a bit of all the things that you've mentioned. For some countries,
Yeah.
for very, very specific reasons, some countries will invest or are investing in the actual concept itself,
Okay.
in terms of what the actual concept offers and the space that the concept, because it's a broad, it's an umbrella concept, it's a catch-all concept.
Yeah.
When you look at it on the surface, it's very difficult to disagree with the terminology and so on. So the terminology, there was very, very deliberate.
Theoretically, it's good. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, when you look at it and it's like, how can you disagree with it? How can you disagree, for instance, with defending the United Nations Charter? Things of that nature, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah, so some African countries will invest in the actual concept,
Mm-hmm.
and also in terms of how they can shape that concept to
Okay.
suit their own domestic situation and their own domestic narrative, right? So that will happen not with all, but with a few countries that happen to share that perspective.
Mhm.
Then with other countries, it will mostly be very, very practical
Yeah.
in terms of, here is a security program that guarantees access
Okay.
to security hardware,
Mm-hmm.
policing systems, surveillance systems, digital surveillance systems, and things of that kind. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
which can be delivered speedily, which is more affordable.
Yeah.
Yes, which is more affordable than what they can get, for instance, from Israel or from India or from other countries that specialize in this type of equipment, right? And it's flexible financing, right?
Yeah.
So for many African countries, in fact, I would say for the vast majority of African countries, it's about a new security package on the scene,
Mm-hmm.
right? That affords them, right, this opportunity of having access to this equipment on flexible terms, on cheaper terms, and which can be delivered quickly to augment whatever it is that they're trying to do internally. I mean, Burkina Faso the other day secured a package, right?
Yeah.
That everybody is talking about in the media, right? So for many African countries, right, that is the primary
Goal.
motivation. That's the primary
Yeah.
motivation. Then for other countries looking for infrastructure finance, looking for finance in terms of energy, looking for equity investment, aligning or embracing or being seen to embrace or agree with the GSI, which is a concept that China is investing very, very heavily in modeling and promoting, associating with that concept provides access to those non-security goods,
Mm-hmm.
non-security programs like
Okay.
loans, like infrastructure, like energy, and so on. So African countries are also trying to play this to their advantage
Mm-hmm.
in an environment, frankly, where you now have resource constraints. You
Exactly.
have international resource constraints, right? So because China has been there and China has shown some willingness, at least, right, to invest in these also sectors.
Yeah.
One way of getting access to that is to align or embrace the GSI without necessarily digesting it.
Exactly.
So,
That's quite
so
an opportunistic perspective on that.
yes,
Like
very opportunistic, very
yeah.
opportunistic, because a lot of the time we tend to look at China as a strategic, powerful, opportunistic actor in Africa,
Yeah.
but we tend to miss the African side of it. That
Exactly. Yeah.
African countries are also highly opportunistic in the ways in which they engage. I mean,
That's the
the
vision
vast
ahead.
majority of Africa, yes, the vast majority of African countries don't really care about what's going on you know, in the South China Sea, for instance.
That's
Well, then maybe, but
exactly.
by showing, support for Chinese positions on those kind of issues, a Chinese diplomat and a Chinese leader is not going to forget that country X voted registered support for China's South China Sea claims. So if they come along with a funding request for a particular project, then the chances are, the Chinese will be amenable. So the African countries are also trying to play that diplomatic game.
And I got that feeling I got that feeling quite often when I look into African engagement to China. And I realize that when you read different FOCAC's resolution, and you get the feeling that the African countries are just signing a piece of paper without really committing to what those agreements are about, what those resolutions are about. And you really have that sense of opportunistic in sense where you say we are ready to sign whatever document they're gonna put in front of us, as long as it guarantees us to have access to financing to things that we need for our own development, but we don't really subscribe to that. That's another conversation. But I'm gonna make another video on that. But based on that opportunistic view, we have those two different views: the opportunistic one, those who are really embracing it, and those who are really touch and go and observing what is it about. What is China perspective on that when it comes to the GSI being implemented in Africa? Do you have the sense that China wants Africans to embrace it fully with the mouth and with the heart, in terms of like having that transfer of values in terms of what security is? Or do you have the sense that China will also be somehow content with the fact that some of them are just embracing it for the show, for the media, without really aligning with that vision? What's your sense of that?
The more I study China-Africa relations, the more I take away the image of a fisherman. So think of China as a fisherman, right? You are
Yeah.
in your canoe, you are out there on the river, and you're trying to catch as many fish as you can, right? So you're going to cast your net wide, and you're going to sit on your boat, and you might throw some incentives, some worms here and there, okay, some breadcrumbs, and then maybe after about 5 hours, you're going to haul your catch,
Yeah.
and you're going to hope that in that catch, okay, you're going to get a particular fish,
Mm-hmm.
right? A particular type of fish or a particular breed of fish
Yeah.
that will get you the most money,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
This is how I tend to think about China. So when you think about the GSI, it's basically China is casting its net as widely as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see that in terms of the articulation of the 6 GSI principles
Mm-hmm.
and the 26 GSI pillars,
Mm-hmm.
designed to be as broad as possible. Okay.
Mhm.
If you can get those that can embrace it conceptually and invest in it, well and good.
Mm-hmm.
If you can get those that will align with it in order to secure policing equipment, military equipment, and so on, well and good, because they are going to register that
Mm-hmm.
in a bilateral document.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at all the bilateral documents that African countries have signed with China over the last 2 years, all of them have a clause on the GSI. All of them
Mhm.
have a clause on the GSI. China
Yeah.
can then go to the international level and say, look, we have 50 countries. Now we have 60 countries. Now we have 70 countries
All adhering
that have
to us.
endorsed the GSI.
Exactly. Yeah.
That exactly. This is similar to what was done with the Belt and Road process. So if you can get those, then well and good. If you can get the opportunistic actors who basically are going to give you endorsement in exchange for infrastructure or energy, that is also good enough.
Exactly.
So
You can be content with that.
yes. So you have the very good, you have the good, and you have the good enough.
Yeah.
What all of them do is they give you endorsement that is reflected either in multilateral documents like FOCAC documents, outcome documents, or bilateral documents that are signed between China and individual countries. So China is basically the fisherman
Yeah.
that is casting the net as wide as possible. And this is typical of Chinese diplomatic behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese diplomatic, the norms always begin broad, and then they
Yeah.
go down to the specific. And it's very, very typical. It's very, very typical. But I also think they are learning, and I think I'm going to go out on a limb here. They're learning from, for instance, the Proliferation Security Initiative of the United States,
Yeah.
which came up during the second Bush administration,
Mhm.
2003, which again, it did not have a secretariat. It is not a formal organization. It's very informal, and countries sign on to it to give it legitimacy. And then from that point, you then move to the specific, where countries that signed on to the Proliferation Security Initiative agreed to certain things, interdicting suspected weapons of, suspected material that could support weapons of mass destruction and so on. And then they move to the specific. I have a feeling, the Chinese diplomats looked at this concept, and perhaps this is where it will go. However, for now, it is still very broad, but the speed at which it is being concretized uh, should also be noted, because now you have trainings, you have programs, you have, we had African officers just in July that were at the
Being in Beijing for like I think 30 of them
Yes.
recent few days.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
In China. Yeah.
GSI mainstreaming and GSI integration into the African peace and security architecture, the China-Africa peace and security architecture, was one of the topics that was discussed in that, right? So now you see GSI being mainstreamed. However, it's not just occurring in FOCAC, as we point out in this study. It's also occurring in those parallel regional institutions like the China CELAC, which is for the Caribbean and Latin American
Exactly.
countries. It's also occurring
Middle
in
East.
the China South, the China Middle East Forum,
Yeah.
China Arab States Forum, and so on. So there's that effort to kind of mainstream it, but again to keep it broad, so as to eliminate potential pushback, disagreements, and so on, and to try as much as possible to align it with what countries can with agreeable issues. No African country will disagree with the idea that the United Nations needs to be defended and that the United Nations Charter needs to be protected. No African country will disagree with that, right?
Yeah.
So you're building affinities in that sense.
Few questions before we wrap up this conversation. Few example when you look into the GSI, how is it implemented in Africa? On your paper, you mentioned a few of them. What kind of thing our audience should be looking into when they want to recognize GSI implementation in Africa? How GSI in Africa looked like?
Okay, one is to look at the agreement. So whenever African countries are signing agreements with the People's Republic of China, that's one way to know about GSI. I mean, some of these, like if you look at the documents that Algeria has signed with China, Algeria is very, very systematic in terms of its engagement with China, right?
A lot of
Look at the
military
GSI.
exercise, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly, and it's clearly spelled out. You look at Egypt as well, very, very clearly spelled out. So that's one way to look at it. The other thing to look out for are the joint mechanisms on law enforcement that China is establishing with African countries. So if you look at the Ethiopia, right, the Ministry of Public Security and their Ethiopian counterpart, which is the Ministry of Policing, signed a collaboration, an agreement, right, that provides for the protection of Belt and Road assets in the country and so on. That's the other way to look at it. A lot of the times, the Chinese media is going to publish these things because the Chinese media also wants to show that this initiative is growing. The third area to look out for are physical institutions. So training institutions. So there's an agreement, for instance, with Ghana to build a China Ghana policing institution, a policing school,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of these things are modeled after similar institutions that the People's Republic of China has built in other regions through similar parallel institutions as FOCA. So I think that's the third element. The fourth element, which is also very important, is the actual training. So China will always release a statement at the end of a training program. For instance, there's a program in Somalia that we mentioned in this report, which was conducted under the GSI framework, and they will tell you what was covered out of that program, the number of officers that were trained in that program, and they will explain how the GSI is mainstreamed into that. And then that story will then be carried by the Somali press and by other African media organizations. So these are the four items to look out
Yeah,
for
yeah,
in terms of GSI implementation and the manifestation of the GSI concept. But it's going to be different in each country.
yeah,
It's going to be different, right? So in Ethiopia, it would be very different from Uganda. For instance, Uganda has an arrangement where the UPDF deploys to protect, for instance, the Chinese industrial parks in the country
yeah.
and so on. That could
And they had the police. Then they had a police exercise, the common police exercise, few years back.
and they had a common policing exercise and so on. In countries like Lesotho, you have a structure. It's an informal structure, but it addresses law enforcement, and that then affords the Lesotho police access to forensic equipment, training in China, in Chinese police academies, and so on. Rwanda has a very, very close relationship with Shandong police, with the Shandong Police Department, which trains the Rwanda police and so on. So it's going to look different in each of these elements. But these are the four areas. These are the four areas to look at.
When I look at those four areas, there's something that comes into my mind: value setting, new value setting, new value shaping. Do we see a kind of value transfer that's happening during those trainings? Do we see a kind of like, I know that I've mentioned it before, but do we see kind of like a transfer of value of during those moments? We just remain very into the up a high level of materialistic engagement?
Potentially, but not always.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially, but not always. Look at a country like Kenya. Kenya has a very tight, very close relationship, for instance, with the PLA.
And it's landed it in hot trouble in Washington D.C. these
Yeah.
days.
Yes. And it also has this program to train 400 police every year.
Yeah.
From the General Service Unit, from the Directorate of Criminal Investigations, and so on. So they have this relationship. But the Kenyan security sector, especially the military, has always retained its apolitical character.
Okay.
It does not intervene in politics. It's not controlled by any political party and so on, right? So, all this training that the Kenyan security actors are doing with China is not necessarily changing Kenya's values when it comes to, for instance, the management of the security sector. Now, in other countries, you might have something very, very similar. Uganda, for instance, has political commissars within its structure. Even with the police, they're political commissars. In Angola and Mozambique, you have a political commissar system, but which operates quite differently.
That's what that was what
would be inclined. Yeah.
that was I was about to mention. I was about to mention the fact that when you look into country where the police force and the military force remain apolitics, far away from military for political influence, those kind of trainings can really work and really empower countries' security forces to become force of good, force of stability, improving their techniques and having access to weapons and all of that. But in countries where you do have a strong political influence within the military services, within the police services, don't you feel there is a kind of fear that people should have in terms of like the kind of value that those services can take from those GSI, in a sense where they say, China share the values of regime stability, regime security, and all of that. There is that sense that maybe they might be empowering bad governance in a context where we still have a lot of young African calling for democracy and much more apolitical security forces. Because, side note, since you mentioned Kenya, if in Kenya the police and the army was really politicized, we wouldn't be able to see what we've saw since last year and since few weeks ago. The youth are on the street trying to protest and all of that. In other countries, they've tried, and we saw how the police and the army reacted in a sense where, because they are highly politicized, they're really going against the protesters. So those are the kind of worriness that people may have looking into those kind of influence of China in GSI.
Yes, an argument can be made that in Kenya, the police is more politicized. The police, the paramilitary, the GSU, and so on. But the military, still, you're not seeing the military on the street.
Yeah.
And even in the 2007 and 2008 post-election violence, I was in Kenya at the time. It was a very frightening experience. The military did not deploy. The military, in fact, there were some regional leaders that were wondering, why isn't the military stepping in? But the military did not step in, and the military, you never see it, right? So still, there's still that element. However, there is a school of thought among African China experts that is sounding a note of alarm and caution.
Yeah.
That the uptake of these values, especially the principle of party control over national security work, and I'm quoting directly from a Chinese document, party control of national security work, that the uptake of that could be potentially promoted, especially among those countries that share this notion of the management of security services. Countries where politicization is basically normalized, where the police works at the behest of the regime, the way when
Exactly. Yeah.
is also existing in these African countries, and they will look for validation from a partner, right, like the People's Armed Police, who comes from a similar tradition, who will basically strengthen that, right? So there is a school of thought, quite a number. In fact, some are quoted in this report, who are sounding a note of caution that this could be highly dangerous for Africa. And secondly, as the report also mentions, Africa is coming out of a very tragic and painful history of dictatorial one-party rule.
Yeah.
And young Africans do not want to go to that. They don't want to go back to that. Because when you look at Afrobarometer reports, upwards of 70% of Africans do not support one-party rule. 80% do not support military rule, right? So they want to live in an environment where the security services are accountable to a higher authority, accountable to civilian authority, to civilian rule. These concepts are antithetical to a concept that basically imposes party rule, absolute party control over the security services. So that's what you say is a serious concern.
Yeah. Those concerns are really shared by many on the continent, by civil society, by scientific, by stakeholders that are trying to understand how the future of China security engagement in Africa look like. There are so many things that we could talk about. I was really thinking of talking about China and the visibility and notion of invisibility and divisibility into the security in a context of, for example, the DRC Rwanda situation, how China would look like in a case like this. I won't touch on that, because if I touch on that, we're gonna go over our time. We're already over time. But Paul, it was really a pleasure to have you on this conversation. And I'm gonna remind you the title of your paper again: Africa as a testing ground for China's global security initiative. It's a very interesting paper to read. It's gonna provide you a lot of perspective on China's security engagement in Africa. Paul has written extensively. I'm gonna not stress this enough. Paul has written extensively on China Africa engagement, and there is a lot to learn. We're gonna put the paper link and reference on the show notes, so you can see what is it about, and you're also gonna see other content that Paul has produced on that issue. We've seen a lot of things happening on China Africa relationship in terms of security these days. We are seeing the expansion of Norinco. Norinco is really now selling weapons left and right and center. Agreement being signed. Chinese drone being bought, Chinese jet fighters being brought, and all of that. Chinese helicopters still being considered a big boat despite having some accident happening here and there. But China is really expanding its security military footprint on the continent, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it's going to look like, and how it's going to shape Africa political stability and have Africa long-term security view of itself and of the international system. So I'm gonna stop here, and Paul, we're gonna continue our conversation off cameras on different issues, but it was a pleasure to have you for this interview. Keep in touch and see you next time.